It's the Worth Knowing live stream, and we're on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube, my very own Substack, Worth Knowing with Matt Robeson. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn. And if you think all of this sounds a heck of a lot like platform inflation, you're right. The number of platforms we're on is climbing faster than egg prices or Donald Trump's excuses for the economy. And that is, of course, what we need to talk about today. It has been a rough week for news on the U.S. economy. Last Wednesday, we got new GDP numbers showing that in the first half of 2025, the economy grew at an anemic annual rate of less than 1.3%, along with signs that there was underlying weakness beneath those top line numbers. On Thursday, last week, we got new inflation numbers showing that the personal consumption expenditures price index, a good measure of core inflation, jumped over 2.6% over the past year, up from an annual pace of 2.4% in May. And on Friday, we got a new jobs report, and it really set off fireworks. The BLS reported that net hiring had plummeted over the past 3 months, with job gains of just 73,000 in July, 14,000 in June, and 19,000 in May. The number of people unemployed for at least 27 weeks rose to over 1.8 million, the highest level since 2017, not counting the brief unemployment surge during the pandemic. For President Donald Trump, each of these new batches of news brought an escalating level of freakout. First, anger at Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell for not lowering interest rates, and then even more anger at the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics for reporting such weak numbers, which culminated in him firing her. So, what a change a week has brought. Last week, economist Jason Furman was explaining in the pages of the New York Times why all of the economist predictions of disaster from Trump's tariffs hadn't come to pass yet. But by the weekend, economists were digging into the new numbers and saying, never mind, all that stuff is coming and it's as bad as we thought. So what's the real story here? How bad is all of this economic news, and where are we likely to go from here? There are few people in America who are more trusted on questions like this than my returning guest, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, Mark Zandi. In his previous appearances on my show, I've labeled him the people's economist because he's so darn good at explaining a lot of complexity, which he does every week on his fantastic podcast, Inside Economics. Mark, you may belong to the dismal profession, but it is delightful to see you again.
Oh, man, it's so good to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Well, it is, I don't know, somehow you always manage to make economics fun on your podcast. And when you appear on my show, we're going to do our best to do that here today. I want to start, this might be a little provocative, to you, but this morning on the New York Times podcast, The Daily, excellent economics reporter, Ben Castleman, said that the overall story to him, the irony, in fact, is that all of these economic numbers are a little soft, but really not that bad. But on Monday, you notably tweeted that the economy is on the precipice of recession. What's Castleman missing, and what's your case for that?
I don't know. I don't know what he's looking at, Matt. I'm not sure. I mean, all the economic data I'm looking at shows an economy that's struggling, not in recession. It's not in recession, at least not yet. And we can talk about, where the economy's headed, but the data are clear. I mean, GDP, that's the value of all the things that we produce, that grew maybe a little over 1% annualized in the first half of the year. That's pretty bad. I mean, kind of a reasonably good economy is 2%. And last year in 2024, we grew almost 3%. Consumer spending, the American consumer drives the economic train. That's gone completely flat this year. The data for June, the spending in June is no higher, maybe even a little bit lower than it was back in December. You mentioned jobs. Job growth has slowed very sharply. You got to take all the factors into consideration, but once you cut through the noise, it looks like underlying monthly job growth is 25, 50K. I mean, that isn't far from zero, and that's the direction of travel here. Manufacturing, that's the part of the economy that's getting hit hardest by the tariffs. That's in recession. It's contracting. Construction, except for data centers, that's booming because everything AI is booming. But outside of that, that's in recession. I don't know. Labor force growth, the labor force, that's the number of people out there working, looking for work. That's also gone flat this year. No change, as the number of immigrants working is now in the labor force is now starting to decline. So I can go on, but you get the picture. This is an economy that is sucking wind, as they say. Again, it's not a recession, at least not yet, but the direction of travel is pretty disconcerting.
Let me add. You know what I feel like we need to do? We're going to do so much math. I need to give my video disclaimer anytime we do the numbers. Let's do our do the numbers video disclaimer.
Nerd alert! It was my understanding that there would be no math.
I don't even know what that means.
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
All right, so let's throw a lot here. Here's your stat of the day.
Yeah.
2% of S&P 500 companies that have posted second quarter results reported declining profit margins, according to the Financial Times. And companies are reporting this kind of margin pressure even as their sales rose, which suggests that their costs are going up, but the companies aren't yet passing those costs on to consumers, which means that there's another shoe left to drop here. And I think that's kind of squaring the circle of what I was alluding to at the top of the show with Jason Furman's like, hey, I got to explain why this isn't all so bad yet. And Derek Thompson was doing on that. And then a couple days later was like, no, actually, wait, never mind. It really is that bad. Cancel. We're on track here again. I'd like to kind of nail a point here that you made in your tweet thread about this yesterday. You wrote, it's no mystery why the economy is struggling. Blame increasing U.S. tariffs and highly restrictive immigration policy. The tariffs are cutting increasingly deeply into the profits of American companies and the purchasing power of American households. Fewer immigrant workers means a smaller economy. Okay. So especially when it comes to the tariff piece, which I think is where people's minds go, although if you want to throw the immigration piece as well, by all means, help us connect the dots here. If the economy is struggling, do we really have strong evidence that Trump's policies are to blame?
Yeah, I think we can draw a very clear connection back to the tariffs and to immigration policy. I mean, the tariffs, they mean higher inflation. We can see the prices for goods that are facing the tariffs now rising more quickly. So it took a bit of time for this to happen, just because of the lags between when the tariffs were implemented and when they show up in the prices of the goods that we buy that are imported. But it's now happening. We saw that very clearly in the June data. So very, very clear. And you can see the tariffs are also weakening growth. Those industries that are most vulnerable to the tariffs, I mentioned manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, distribution, wholesaling. All the data show that those are the parts of the economy that are struggling the most. So yeah, I think we can draw a very clear line between what the policies are, the tariffs and immigration policy, and right back to what it means for the economy. And this is all roughly sticking to script. I do think people were overly impatient, thinking that okay, here are the tariffs, okay, here are the higher prices. It takes some time. I mean, just given all the moving parts involved, the front loading of imports that came into the country earlier in the year, you had to work those down. Many business people, they didn't know where the tariffs were going to land, so they didn't want to raise prices and get wrong-footed, lose market share. So they ate the higher costs of the tariffs. As you pointed out, margins are down. There's just a boatload of and just the lags involved in actually raising prices. It just takes some time. But here we are. The tariffs really only started to kick into gear a couple, 3 months ago, and here we are. Prices for the goods that are imported are now rising, and rising very quickly. And growth in those sectors of the economy that are most tied or most directly affected by the tariffs are now starting to sink. So yeah, I think it's very easy to connect the dots.
Could you help fill in just a piece of this that I think was widely reported as in kind of explainer pieces on all of this? The fact that the first quarter GDP looked fairly weak. Second quarter GDP looked, by comparison, relatively strong, like 0.5% and 3% respectively. And part of that is due to the way the number is counted and the way imports are subtracted out. And this sort of rang a bell for me, because back when I was an economics student at the dawn of time, this was so long ago that we were still using GNP, not GDP.
Oh yeah.
And so like I was, I think I followed that, but this seemed like an important point. The fact that what was happening here was a lot of front loading, it's a lot of stockpiling of inventory on the part of, the 10% of the economy that is tied to imports. And so this was part of Jason Furman's argument as well. That tended to mute the impacts of tariffs, and it also tended to depress the readings on GDP in the first quarter, but then maybe inflate them a little bit in the second quarter. Do I have that story right? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, there's big swings in imports. Understandably, right? You're a company that imports product from the rest of the world. President Trump was talking about tariffs long before he was elected. He was elected. Tariffs are coming. You don't know how high the tariffs are going to be, how broad based, to what. You don't know any of that, but they're coming, and so you want to bring in as much product, as much imports as you possibly can before the tariffs hit. And that's what happened in Q1, and that depressed GDP growth, the value of all the things that we produce. But then, that reversed itself in the second quarter because you brought all this stuff in, and that caused GDP growth to pop. So the way to really understand, what it means for the economy is you just simply average those 2 quarters to abstract from the swings in imports. And if you do that, you get GDP growth of, as I said earlier, just a little over 1%. 1%, to be precise, because this is a nerdy topic, 1.2%. That is below what the economists call the economy's potential, meaning that rate of growth necessary to maintain enough job growth to support low unemployment. And it's also well below the growth we got last year. 2024 was a really good year. We almost had 3% growth with declining inflation, but this year we're getting 1% growth with accelerating inflation. So it's a really tough year already, and again, it's clearly, obviously related to the tariffs and the immigration policy.
I want to get into the inflation side of this, and I think my way in is going to be to bring up MJ, who's up on the screen right here. I want to go back to an earlier comment in which she said the dreaded S word. No, not that S word. She said stagflation. Now, I always think of too many deer to hunt in hunting season, but stagflation brings back echoes of the 70s and this dreaded combination of anemic or negative growth and high inflation. When I was, again, back at the dawn of time, a budding economics student, we were taught that there was a trade-off between those two things and that stagflation should be, hard to achieve. So here's a two-parter for you. What in the heck is stagflation, and are we on the verge of seeing it?
Stagflation-esque. It's not the virulent form of stagflation we saw in the 70s and 80s. That was double-digit inflation, double-digit unemployment. But we're moving, directionally towards stagflation. That's just higher inflation and weaker economic growth at the same time. And the tariff policy and the immigration policy reinforce each other in causing stagflation. The tariffs, by definition, raise prices. That's inflation. And it cuts into people's real purchasing power. It cuts into businesses' profit margins and their ability and willingness to invest and hire. That lowers growth. That's a stagflation. Then you throw in the immigration policy, same fallout. It reduces the labor force, raises the cost of labor, adds to inflation. But because you have fewer workers in key sectors where labor market's already been tight, like construction and manufacturing and agriculture, immigrants work in lots of different industries, that weakens economic growth. So both those policies work in the same way to raise inflation, lower growth, cause stagflation. Now, the thinking is that we won't get back to the kind of virulent stagflation we had in the 70s and 80s because the Federal Reserve knows better. The reason why we got into that mess in the 70s and 80s is because the Fed's independence was impaired. Richard Nixon, the president in the early 70s, and his buddy Arthur Burns, who was chair of the Fed, decided to keep rates very low in the lead up to the 1972 election to kind of juice the economy, and that unleashed inflation. And of course, the Fed also made a bunch of mistakes in that period, they didn't understand, the effect of inflation expectations, which we can talk about. Today, the thinking is the Fed's independent and will do whatever is necessary to ensure we don't get into that mess of double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment. But obviously, that's also a matter of some concern now in the current context.
Wow, that was delightfully primly put, Mark.
Good.
Yes, you are a master of euphemism. So what you're saying is it's not necessarily historically great for the president to start messing around with the independence of the Fed or economic reporting agencies or other mechanisms that are supposed to be above board. Interesting. I just want to also throw a shout out here to the Cynthia Rice. Golf clap to you. You worked for Paul Volcker. Good for you. I am suitably impressed by the depth of your expertise. Okay, let's talk more about inflation. And I'm going to do something dangerous to myself here. Every time I've interviewed you in the past, I get transported back. It's about 3 decades. I was a college student. I was an econ major. And I was just so, I'm sure people can believe this about me. I was just so eager to make sure that my professors thought that I was learning something. And so I always feel this need to get evaluated by my wise professor, who in this case is you. So I'd like to ask you to evaluate what I wrote on Friday about inflation. Okay, if you give me a C- on this. Okay. My ego can take it.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. So here we go. This is me. Inflation is officially up. The Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation rose 2.6% in June, up from an annual pace of 2.4% in May. Now, that isn't exactly Weimar Republic hyperinflation, but it's a lot like the old saying about a grandfather clock that chimes 13 times at noon. It's not only bad in itself, but it calls the whole underlying mechanism into question. In this case, inflation is not only higher than the Fed wants it to be, but its persistence at elevated levels also suggests that all of the Fed's efforts to wring inflation out of the economy aren't doing enough. It's like a patient being on antibiotics for a month and still running a fever. There's still an underlying infection. Mark, what do you make of that summary?
Yeah, I like that a lot. Why would I give that a C-? That felt like an A to me. I mean, not only was it dead on factually, in terms of the numbers itself, but you kind of nailed the metaphors and everything else. So I thought that's pretty good. I like the whole antibiotic.
You're my daily affirmation, man.
There
I love
you go.
it.
Yeah, no, I thought it was dead on. I mean, 2.6, the core PCE deflator, that's excluding food and energy. And the reason why economists tend to focus on that is because that does a better job of forecasting where you're headed. That's 2.8% year over year. And in the month of June, it was up, annualized, somewhere between 3.5%. And that feels like, Matt, where we're headed. That feels like, given the tariffs, where the effective tariff rate seems to be landing, and based on historical experience and pass through to consumers, by early next year, spring or so, we should be seeing inflation in the consumer expenditure deflator, the measure you mentioned, of 3.5% to 4%. And that clearly is going to be uncomfortable for Americans, and obviously well above the Fed's 2% inflation target.
So here's the big question.
Yeah.
Was Powell right to leave interest rates unchanged?
I think he's got it. Yes, even though growth is slowing, he's got to worry about inflation. He's got a dual mandate. The mandate is a full employment economy, check, and inflation that's low and stable, and that's defined by the Fed to be 2%. We're nowhere close, and we're going in the wrong direction. And here's the thing that probably was the deciding factor. It's the uncertainty around the economic policies that has the Fed frozen in place. So the Fed, if it had a very clear sense of where the tariffs were going to land, what they're going to look like, which products, which countries, so forth and so on, it could do a better job of doing a forecast of inflation and growth, and may at that point decide to actually cut interest rates because it's focused on growth and it feels like inflation is not going to continue on. But because of the uncertainty, because the tariffs are up, they're down, they're all around, no idea where they're going to land, the Fed says, I just don't know what to do with this. And therefore, it's sitting on its hands and not cutting interest rates. Completely get it. That's, monetary policy 101. in that kind of situation, you would kind of sit on your hands. And, these policies, tariffs and restrictive immigration, they really complicate things for the Fed in the context of that dual mandate, because again, those policies lead to higher inflation. All else equal, that would argue for higher interest rates, but it weakens growth. All else equal, that would argue for lower rates. So, okay, you're at the Fed. What do you do with that? You say, oh, I don't know. Therefore, you sit on your hands. So the answer is, to your question, is Powell doing the right thing? Yeah, that's exactly what I think most economists would do in the situation that we find ourselves in.
I want to follow up on interest rates, inflation. I have to first say to Lefty Gramps, okay, Boomer, you're right. And also, I'd say that Gen Xers be where it's at from my own perspective. I'd like to stand up for my own generation. I'd also like to say thank you to all the people in the chats raising comments. And if you have, I did tease this, if you do have questions, since we have the people's economist here who can give actual informed answers on very, very deep questions, please, by all means, I will throw them in the chats, and I will do my very level best to throw them at Mark. I want to, just following up on the interest rate aspect of this. Okay, mea culpa, wise professor. I always had a problem. I had like a mental disconnect between interest rates and trade and inflation. Something about like international monetary flows just never clicked. The rest of economics, great. There was something about this. I don't know. It never quite hit the right sequence of synapses for me. So I want to take a look at two things in the long run in the big picture.
Yeah.
First, there's a new analysis from the Congressional Budget Office that's re-estimated the fiscal impact of, I'm not going to use Trump's dumb name for it, let's just call it the Republican budget. And what they're finding is that it will increase the federal deficit by 4.1 trillion over a decade. And because of that, it's going to drive up interest rates, increasing interest payments on the nearly $37 trillion national debt by $718 billion over a decade. Wow, that's a lot of big numbers that I'm throwing out at everyone. But just so I'm following this here, I'm following the logic of this here. Last week, Donald Trump freaked out at Jerome Powell for not lowering short-term interest rates because he wants to goose the economy right now. But at the same time, in the long run, because of his budget, because of his bill, he set up this massive weight of upward pressure on interest rates. It's going to be like trying to run with a boulder tied to our waist in terms of future economic growth. Is that right? Am I reading this right?
Well, clearly the budget bill that was passed does nothing to address the nation's long-term fiscal problems. I don't think the legislation broadly makes the fiscal situation worse compared to current policy. If we had just followed current policy, and compare it to what we're going to get under this legislation, it's equally disconcerting. The deficits are going to remain large, 6% of GDP. The so-called primary deficit, that's the deficit excluding interest payments, that's 3% of GDP. And Matt, you got to remember that this is all happening in a full employment economy. The economy has a 4.2% unemployment rate. What's going to happen when we go into recession? And it may not be this time, but at some point we're going into recession. And then what happens to the deficits? And of course, that adds to the nation's debt, which is already very high. The publicly traded debt to GDP ratio is 100%, more than double what it was before the financial crisis. And by the way, we're all to blame for that. Republicans, Democrats, and everyone in between, we all have contributed to that in one way or another. And here we are. And under the budget that was just passed, the bill that was just passed, the debt to GDP ratio is going to rise another 10, 20 percentage points, over the next 10 years. Wow. That is going to add to long-term interest rates, significantly add to long-term. The CBO, they did some really good research here, and they have concluded that for every percentage point increase in the debt to GDP ratio, that'll add, 1 to 3 basis points. So I'll make that concrete, do the arithmetic for you. If we go from 100% debt to GDP today to say 120% debt to GDP, let's say, 10 years from now, that's a 20 percentage point increase multiplied by 2 basis points. That's 40 basis points. So the 10-year treasury yield is going to go from something around 4 to something closer to 4.5. And of course, the direction of travel here too is very clear. It's just going to keep on rising. Mortgage rates, which more people kind of focus on, instead of being between 6.5% and 7%, which is where they are today, they'll be between 7 and 7.5. Talk about housing unaffordability. We're going to have that more of that. So that legislation, it doesn't make things worse than they were. That kind of the trend lines, when the president took office, but they don't make them any better. And of course, they're bad. They're very, very bad. Now, I do. One quick caveat that makes me more worried is that some of the provisions in this legislation around tax cuts in particular, they expire within a few years. This was done to make the budget pass through reconciliation, the budget process. But as we know, once you give someone a tax cut, pretty hard to take it away. So if, in fact, you think, 4 or 5 years from now, when this comes around again, the next that Congress and that president decide to extend the tax cuts, then yes, the deficits and debt are going to be even higher than they are today. So all this is going to add to interest rates. So yeah, I mean, we could talk about the Fed lowering rates, but at the end of the day, what really matters here most is, it's what's happening with long-term interest rates, long-term treasury yields, and they're headed up. They're headed higher. There's nothing the Fed can do about that. They don't have control over that, at least not in the world that, we have navigated in up to this point in time. There's things that we could talk about that, that the next president might do, this president or the next president might do to address this. But, I do think we should buckle in. We're headed for, higher interest rates, here going forward.
On the subject of interest rates and bond yields and the long run, this is where we take the nerdiness that we are imbuing into today's show and we take it to 11. I want to talk about the bond market. The thing that ended the brief experiment with Liberation Day was that the bond markets started to show signs of an imminent freakout. At least I'm asserting this. That was the reporting. You're verifying.
Yeah.
And at the time, this was April 9th, Harvard economist, former Harvard president, former Treasury Secretary Lawrence Summers said, developments in the last 24 hours suggest we may be headed for serious financial crisis, wholly induced by U.S. government tariff policy. So the idea here was tariffs were creating a bond market freakout, a yield spike, and the suggestion that we could be in serious trouble with our debt that would cascade through the U.S. economy. And that is what caused this Oval Office intervention. Someday someone's going to make an awesome movie about this, where like behind the backs of the pro-tariff hawks in the White House, I believe it was Scott Bessent who went behind the scenes and said, sir, you're about to crash the world economy. You really don't want to do that. You've got to bail out. So here's my question. We seem to be now in kind of, I guess, Liberation Day round 3 at this point, some kind of like weird chimera amalgam of it's sort of the initial set of tariffs. Some of them are paused, some of them are reduced, but overall, our tariff rates are still massively elevated from where they were when Trump came into office. And I guess what I don't fully understand here is, why isn't this presenting the exact same long-term risk to bond markets and interest rates? This risk that investors could durably lose confidence in U.S. treasuries in some kind of a sustained way. Just because he's muted things a little bit, it seems like the basic idea of the risk here should still very much be there. What are you seeing? Like, how much are we playing with fire here?
Yeah, I agree. I do think the preconditions for a major sell-off in the bond market, financial markets more broadly are high, are in place and high. The risks are high. For all the reasons you gave, and then some. We are running large deficits and debt that is going to continue. We just discussed, ad infinitum into the future. There is clearly some growing concern about the safe haven status of the United States. Global investors are asking themselves, is the U.S. the place where I would want to put my money if, things were going off the rails? And that's why you can see, things like crypto prices at record levels. So people are going into crypto as opposed to,
Mm.
why gold prices and silver prices are at record highs, why the value of the dollar has declined, in a time, historically, when you're kind of in a uncertain risk-off environment, so-called risk-off environment, money comes flowing here, the value of the dollar rises, but in the current situation, it's declined. So there's still a great deal of angst, uncertainty, out there. And so I do think I wouldn't declare the coast is clear here on the bond market. I think the risk that at some point in the not too distant future, I don't know exactly when that would be, is it 3, 6, 12 months, 3, 6, 12 years? I'm not sure. But if the trend lines continue as they are, I do think at some point the bond market and global investors are going to say enough already. I'm not getting compensated for the risk I'm taking. You got to pay me a much higher interest rate. The bond market sells off. Now, I do think we've kind of dodged the bullet that was fired back in April. Back in April, that was a period of it was just pure shock, right? What the heck is going on? You saw Liberation Day tariffs. You saw the way they were calculated. You saw the way they were rolled out. You go, what? Whoa! What does this all mean? And I think that it's the surprise and the shock that caused markets to go into tailspin, the bond market to sell off, for Treasury Secretary Bessent to kind of say, "Hey, we got to pull this back to try to get things back on track here," which they did do. So I think it was the shock of it all. But I don't think that, again, Matt, I agree with you. I don't think the coast is clear. I think the preconditions for a major sell-off in markets, the bond market, are in place.
Well, that's bracing.
Yep.
And I'm far from an expert on the bond markets, but friends who are experts in the bond markets, they were calling me in April, like, it's time for a full-fledged freak out here, and that is very disquieting. Let's talk BLS. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is, a quiet agency, most of the time chugging along, doing its job. And of course, after this entire episode over the last few days, it's having a moment in the sun. It prompted me to write about it on Substack yesterday. And the general theme at kind of a unintended consequences level of, here's the waterfall of things that could start to happen if you mess with the numbers that the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out. If you start to put your thumb on the scale for political purposes to all of those numbers, here are the problems that you're going to incur. And I felt pretty clever about all that. And I'm happy to throw some of these out here.
Yeah.
But it prompted an immediate reaction from a friend of mine who emailed me. He grew up behind the Iron Curtain. I have to keep his name anonymous, because this is someone who still resides in a place where you can't say stuff like this. Here's what he wrote to me. This is kind of the bigger problem in his mind. Socialism came crashing down in 1989 because they mismanaged the economy and couldn't keep up with capitalist production, especially in the military. A big part of socialist economic management, besides a planned economy, is to always paint a rosy picture of the economy, regardless of the actual situation. Trump may seem innovative, but he's just reinventing socialism step by step. You're not allowed to criticize the leader. All parts of the administration are forced to disregard facts and lie to paint a favorable picture, and loyalty matters more than anything else, such as competence. This experiment has been run, was called the Soviet Union, and it failed spectacularly. Mark, what do you make of kind of that big picture level of concern about what can start to happen to your economy when you start to mess with the truth about what's happening in it?
Yeah, obviously, I think it's critically important for the government statistical agencies to be transparent in the way they construct the data and announcing and releasing the data, and that's critical to a well functioning economy. It's important to making good policy. I mean, how can the Federal Reserve know what the right policy is if it doesn't have data that it can trust? It goes to good business decisions. Home builders need to know how many jobs are being created, to know how many homes they need to build and where to put them and construct them. Uh, Retailers need to know how consumers are doing, what's going on in the job market, to know how consumers are going to do, how much they're going to spend, so that they can make sure that they have the products on the store shelves that consumers want and need. Go on and on and on. A well-functioning economy, market economy, our economy has thrived and benefited enormously from high quality data that comes from mostly from the U.S. government, because only the U.S. government can put this data together, because the economy is a very large place, a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of concerns about privacy, and you got to protect the data. There's cyber issues, and you need the government to provide that resource and it's a public good, and it does a lot of good when when it is high quality and people trust it. So I think, is very clear, and I think there's reasons to be nervous, worried, disconcerted if it feels like that the data quality is going to be impaired, or the availability, or the timeliness, and all the other things that we value in the data that we get from the federal government. So this is really very, very important. And by the way, Matt, it's not only about the reality of it all; it's about the perception of it.
Hmm.
We have to trust that the data that we're getting are good. Now, I will say, the BLS is a very professional institution. It's been operating for many decades, has a lot of tried and true processes and methodologies. It's definitely under a lot of pressure, but to change those things in any meaningful way is going to be difficult to do. Certainly in any near term period, it'll take a lot of time and energy to undermine the kind of that professionalism and the quality information that we get. So I take that we need to consider that, and I think that'll ultimately win the day. And the other thing I'd say, Matt, is the American economy isn't the Soviet Union circa whatever 1960, 1970, 1980. We're a large, very complex economy, lots of moving parts, lots of alternative data sources are available from all over the place, and we're going to know, collectively, we're going to know if the data doesn't conform with the reality of what we're seeing. There'll be more debate, there'll be more uncertainty. Again, it's not conducive to a well-functioning economy, but we'll figure it out. There'll be other information that comes to the fore, and people will know it. So I don't think in our economy, in this period of time, that someone can say something and it not be true, and people actually believe it. I just don't see that. I don't think that will be the case. But it's unfortunate we have to go through this. And I will say one last thing I'll say on the topic, and we can talk about more. But one thing that comes to mind is, the BLS, like every other institution that does surveys, and this very well when you look at the political polls, are
Sure.
having trouble collecting data. I mean, people are not responding to surveys. Their businesses aren't responding. There's a lot of fatigue for lots of different reasons, and so the response rates are down. So it is really important to focus on that, to try to get higher quality data. But at the end of the day, that doesn't argue for a budget cut, which is what the BLS has been struggling with. The DOGE cuts, cut deeply into the BLS payrolls. That argues for more funding, more resource, because we've got to do better in surveying our economy to get the information that we need to make good decisions, policy making decisions and business decisions.
What this brings up for me is, and I don't know, there's something about the conversation that keeps bringing me back to my original study of economics decades ago. And I think there's been a lot that's changed in the field. There's I guess, a perception that it's a very mature, social science, and it is, but things have changed. For example, I learned nothing about behavioral economics at the time.
Hmm.
I learned the old kind of classic treat markets like an ideal gas, with lots of constituent atoms in them. And um, it turns out the psychology of how people process information
Hmm.
and their biases has a ton to do with macroeconomic performance and microeconomic performance. You were talking about the role of inflationary expectations, not just inflation, but the psychology of what we expect to happen in the future. You were just talking about the role of confidence and the perception that you have a truth-telling government that's accurately reflecting what's going on. So there's psychological factors. There's also been tremendous changes in technology. And in fact, there were two members of the Fed Board of Governors who dissented from Fed Chair Powell's decision to hold interest rates steady. They wanted to lower interest rates. And the reasoning they gave was that they thought that productivity increases in the economy had made it such that we could sustain a lower interest rate and we could have higher growth without creating inflation. So here's the question that I want to get you out of here on, because programming alert, Mark is a very, very busy economist, and I've got to get him out of here in 2 minutes. How has your thinking changed in how you look at the numbers you're seeing in the economy, the way you think about the dynamics within the economy in the last 10 or 15 years, as you've kind of appreciated new factors, either psychological or technological?
Well, you make a great point. When I went to school before you did, and it was much more, technocratic. We thought we could write it down in write it down and put it in a model, and you produce a forecast with a model, and it'll be right. And of course, we've been rudely disabused of that thinking. And I do think sentiment is and psychology are vitally critical to understanding the dynamics of the economy and how it's going to all play out. And at the end of the day, I think a recession, which is obviously something we want to avoid, a contraction in economic activity, job loss, higher unemployment, that is a loss of faith at the end of the day. Consumers lose faith that they're going to hold on to their job. They pull back on their spending. It's a loss of faith by business people that they're going to be able to sell what it is that they produce to those consumers. And then they start laying off, and you get into this kind of self-reinforcing negative vicious cycle, and that's called a recession. So you're absolutely right. I think, and try modeling that, Matt. We're trying. There's all kinds of efforts to first measure. How do you measure things like sentiment and uncertainty? How do you actually put that into a number that you can put into a database that you can model? And then how do you model it and how do you use it? And it's, obviously, very, very difficult to do. The other thing that, is unique, or maybe unique's too strong a word, but in that vein, is that the current situation, the current problems we're facing are the result of policy decisions. It's not like some pandemic came along and knocked us off the rails, or a global financial crisis. That was the result of many, many, many factors. This is, we've decided to go down a certain policy path with tariffs and restrictive immigration, highly restrictive immigration, Doge cutting, and it's those policies, and those policies can change in an instant. And so, how do you think about the economy, how it's performing, and where it's headed, with that as a backdrop? And so, I'll have to say, in the 35 years I've been a professional economist, I've rarely been as unsure about the economic outlook as I am today. During the pandemic, for sure, during the GFC, for sure. Other than that, I think this is the most unsure I've been about the economy in that 35 years.
One of the things that I think is great about your show, and when I was on, you were asking me about, like, well, how do you factor in things like, relative political risk to your modeling? It's like, well, I'm not sure I have meaningful inputs to give you on questions like that. But one of the great things about your show is hearing smart economists grapple with questions like this, and kind of seeing the sort of the science and also sort of like the human element behind what you do as you really you think scientifically about questions like this. So I commend your show to everyone inside economics. I commend your Substack. I'll pop it back up here. You're up on the Contrarian. Is that right?
Well, that's Jared Bernstein, isn't it? Yeah. He obviously he's a good friend, and I like him a lot, and so we think a lot alike. So I participated. I haven't really talking about platforms going back to the beginning of your show. There's so many I can't keep track, I've opened up a Substack, but I really haven't engaged. But I plan to as soon as I figure it all out.
We'll drag you on. We're going to drag you on, but we are going to get you out because I made a commitment to try to respect your time frame. What you should do is just channel all of your work into joining me here. That's what
we got to have you back on Inside Economics, Matt.
All right,
it's that
plan. Done and done. All right, everyone. Mark Zandi. You can follow him. Here's all of the info that Jim Williams so helpfully scraped for us. Thanks for being on, and I will see you real soon.
Yeah, take care, everyone.
All right. Matt. All right, we're going to boot Mark out, and we're going to go into the next portion of our show. And here's what we're going to do. I'm not entirely sure exactly if I'm going to make this a bonus for worth knowing subscribers. I may put out bits of this, but one of the things I've been trying very hard to do on my Substack, and look, it's been evolving. I've been trying to figure this out as I go, is I'm really trying to lean into the name of it that I chose. I loved the name Worth Knowing. If there was sort of a unifying thought for me and what I wanted to write about, what I wanted to focus on in politics and the intersection with psychology and economics and history and sports and all the stuff that kind of gets me going, it was this idea of, well, what's worth knowing? Because there's so much, I don't know, there's like a deluge of crap in the news, and it's depressing and it's demoralizing, and it turns me off from wanting to engage with the news. And I feel like a lot of people feel that way as well. And so what I wanted to focus my efforts on is things that I thought were worth knowing based on my experience in politics, working as a congressional staffer, working in economics, and trying to connect some of those dots in a way that would be helpful and meaningful and entertaining and interesting. So what I want to do in the final few minutes here is hit on just a few of those things that I really think are worth knowing. We're going to bring on our worth knowing intern in just a couple of minutes, because he has been hard at work digging through the news to try to unearth things that are worth knowing. And I want to hit you with just a few of these. The first, and some of these, by the way, if you follow me on Substack, if you follow me on the Substack app, oh my gosh, MJ, you're forgiven. You're forgiven. I appreciate the subscription. Thank you very much. If you follow me on Substack, you will see some of these things that I've hinted at in Substack posts. All right, let me give you topic number one. I'd like to propose to people that Donald Trump just gave the Democratic Party a massive gift, saving us from ourselves. I think Trump saved us from walking into an Epstein trap. And what I mean is that for about 2 weeks, maybe 3, all that anyone could talk about was Epstein. And I think it was fool's gold. I mean, to be clear, it is a genuine problem for Donald Trump. It splits his base. It creates a real kind of mental schism for the MAGA people who bought into this whole man behind the curtain conspiracy theory. It is a problem for him. But it was also fool's gold for Democrats, because the more Democrats talked about it, the more the issue became polarized. And the more it enabled Trump to rally Republicans back to him. Now, we saw that effect happen when the Wall Street Journal published Donald Trump's love letter to Jeffrey Epstein. What happened? It gave Trump a familiar villain to focus his energy on. And when they had that common enemy, boom, Republicans rallied back to Trump. And Mike Johnson ran cover for him and recessed Congress and shut down all the questions. And of course, Democrats, seeing an opening there, were anxious to get back to this. But I think they have been saved from this. And by the way, speaking of our intern, Nicholas, this is something he's working on writing up and pulling together the polling for this right now. I think there's a very strong case around this. But The point is that Democrats don't take that gold. It's fool's gold. Don't take it. Don't take the bait. What Democrats really need to be talking about is what we've been talking about today, the Trump-induced disaster in the economy and the Republican budget. Now, I'm going to quickly show you some numbers about this. Who are the voters that we need to get? Okay. This is, I think, one of the most important charts, one of the most important data sets that I've seen in the past year. This is from Data for Progress. And it shows that Kamala Harris actually won among voters who pay attention. Donald Trump won only on the backs of people who pay little to no attention to political news. He won by 19 points. So the people that we need to break through to, we're already winning among people who are paying attention. The people we need to break through to are people who are paying some attention. Well, what else do we know from polling? We know that in recent weeks, Americans have been hearing a lot of negative news about Donald Trump. But look at these word clouds down at the bottom here. Okay, on the left is the overall word cloud. In the middle is the word cloud of what people are hearing, the negative news that people are hearing among active news consumers. Over on the right is what people are hearing if they're a passive news consumer. Remember, that's the group that Democrats need to win. And look at how much bigger again, I'm going to say it here, I didn't want to, the big, beautiful bill is. Look at how much bigger it is. The big, beautiful bill, the Republican budget, is something that is breaking through with the exact set of voters that we need to get through to. And by the way, we also know from Navigator polling that this is something that voters really care a lot about. So the upshot is Epstein, and I see it, people are saying it right here in the chats. It's a wedge. And it's I mean, I don't want to say it's a good thing. That sounds really bad. I'm not in any way suggesting that this horrible tragedy of what Jeffrey Epstein did is a good thing. Politically, in terms of defeating Donald Trump, it is an opening for Democrats, but it's one that they have to have the discipline not to exploit. It's one that they have to let play out. If they engage, it becomes polarized, and it gives Trump a way to wiggle out. Okay, that's point number one. And I am going to, hey, Nicholas, if you're out there, I sent you the link. So looking forward to you jumping on. I want to go to another one. I made a case just before this live stream that Donald Trump is getting desperate. And you can tell because he's trying to go back to playing what in his mind are the hits, but are actually flops. He's gone back this week. Pam Bondi came out and said, this is the most pressing legal problem in America, people. We are once again going to go back and investigate the Russia investigation back in 2016. That is Americans' most pressing problem. Now, I want to this is going to be a very quick, if you subscribe to Worth Knowing, you'll see it. I did a video on Cliff's Edge. I did a video 2 years ago where I gave the whole picture, the whole background on this. I thought it was pretty funny, actually. I think it's worth watching, and I put it out on my Substack again today. Here's the nutshell version. Just to recap. In 2016, Russia mounted a massive operation to make Donald Trump president. Trump and his campaign played along and helped out. Now, that was the finding of the Republican-led Senate Intelligence Committee. It's not me saying it. This is Republican senators reached that conclusion. Now, so did the Mueller report. And when the Mueller report came out, you'll all remember that Trump was pretty successful in twisting the narrative and saying, well, it was all a witch hunt. And then Bill Barr, you remember he did the thing where he put out the memo and said it was a total exoneration, right? He kind of whitewashed it. He regretted that later. So that's the backdrop. But that was a little bit successful for Trump. It was a little bit successful. So he went back to the well again. The next time he ran into a problem and he needed a storyline, he created a sequel. His allies and Trump concocted this conspiracy theory that it was Trump who was the victim of an FBI conspiracy that was behind the whole Russia probe. And so the Inspector General for the Department of Justice launched a multi-year investigation, a Republican appointed Inspector General, and found, yeah, there were errors by the FBI. They filed for investigative privileges that they should not have had. They filed for warrants they should not have had access to. Okay, they made mistakes. But fundamentally, there was no political bias. That was their finding. No political bias. And then, despite that, despite kind of getting owned, when Trump needed a storyline again, he went back to the well that was now dry again. You remember John Durham? He appointed John Durham as a special counsel to look into everything again. And after 4 years, and I go through all of this in the video, after 4 years, he found nothing. I sound like the Untouchables. You've got nothing. You don't have the bookkeeper. You've got nothing. He found nothing. He found nothing. He reiterated, yeah, the FBI made some mistakes, but he found nothing. Along the way, part 4 of the sequel, Trump sued Hillary Clinton. You might not even remember this. He sued Hillary Clinton on the basis of his conspiracy theory. And a federal judge not only laughed him out of court, but called the lawsuit frivolous and fined Trump $1 million for wasting the court's time. So that's why I assert that the fact that Trump is having Bondi bring this up again is a sign. It reeks of desperation. Reeks of desperation. By the way, I'm trying to catch up to the chats. Sorry, while I'm ranting, it's hard to chat and rant at the same time. Maybe when Nicholas comes on, I'll be able to do it more. So that's point number 2. I know it's really annoying to hear Trump bring up the Russia investigation, but I think it's a good sign. I think it's a sign that he is truly desperate to change the narrative. So let's not let him do it. Third one. I'm going to sprain a shoulder attempting to pat myself on the back here. I know. I'm sorry. I don't want to sound like, a know-it-all douchebag. But 10 days ago, I wrote an article in Newsweek saying that this redistricting war that Republicans are launching again is a giant mistake. It's hurting everyone. And I suggested that maybe there's a way out. But there was a point, now that it's kind of taken shape and it looks like exactly what was on the horizon 10 days ago is coming to pass. And Texas has pushed ahead under Greg Abbott. And now Gavin Newsom is pushing back. And Kathy Hochul in New York is getting in on it. And the Democrats from Texas have fled. Now that all of that has come to pass, I want to go back to one argument that I made kind of embedded inside this Newsweek article. And it was reprinted. Cliff posted it on the Blue Amp Substack, and then I cross-posted it on mine. So you can all read it, or you can just go to Newsweek, read it there. My argument was that this predatory gerrymandering war that Republicans launched over 20 years ago has hurt them the most. Here's why. And here's the backstory. In 2003, you remember Tom DeLay? Tom the Hammer DeLay? You probably remember this. So for decades, there was kind of this tacit truce in America between the parties where basically they just didn't redistrict very much. It changed a little bit in the 1960s because the Supreme Court had these rulings that required them to redistrict based on growth in certain districts, between the censuses. So after every census, they kind of the party settled into a pattern where they redistricted a little bit, but they mostly tried to take care of incumbents. Tom DeLay, in 2000, we had the census. There was a redistricting in Texas, and DeLay said, well, hold on a second. If I wait until Republicans control the legislature, I can launch an ambush. That's what he did. In 2003, he affected, because he was, the U.S. House of Representatives, he basically maneuvered to have the Texas legislature come back and redraw all the districts. And it worked. It worked. This kind of new, what I call predatory gerrymandering. I mean, this power grab, it worked. And they grabbed 5 more seats at the time. And that led into the whole Republican Red Map project, by which, using $30 million raised by Karl Rove, they strategically retook state legislatures in 2010 so that they could control the redistricting. They instituted massive gerrymanders that continue to persist. So the example I give in the article, in 2012, Democrats won 1.4 million more votes for the U.S. House than Republicans. Republicans won the chamber 234 to 201. So that's the kind of gerrymandering we're talking about. But here's my argument about why this hurts Republicans more than Democrats. It led directly to the MAGAification of the party. It created Donald Trump. It created the opening for him to have a leveraged takeover of the Republican Party. Because in order to achieve the backlash they were looking for politically that would enable them to win in 2010 and then control redistricting, they had this AstroTurf movement called the Tea Party. And you probably remember that it quickly broke lab containment. And the Tea Party kind of ran amok, turned on its creators, and they unleashed these insane, like Christine O'Donnell, the witch from Delaware. You remember her? Like, Todd Aiken, all these nutballs, which caused them to lose elections. And in the course of unleashing these angry populist forces, they enabled Donald Trump to tap into them a couple of years later, and with a small, energized segment of the Republican Party, win the primary in 2016 and then win the presidency. And the point is that because Republicans increasingly began to see that a Trump endorsement, Trump backing, was the key within their primaries, and because they had engineered all of these districts, both legislative and congressional, to be safe Republican hothouses, they could have these exotic right-wing flowers bloom. And that's how you ended up with this giant MAGA faction in state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress. That's how old-style establishment Republicans lost control of their own party, because they essentially did this Frankenstein's monster of the Tea Party and redistricting, and they created the seed bed where all of these nuthouse candidates could take root. And now they completely control the party. And so my point in the argument, in the article was, do Republicans really want to double down on this yet again? Do they really want to put, with Donald Trump leaving office after 2028, more eggs in the Trump basket for them to rot? I don't think that they do. I don't think they want to go down this road. And Greg Abbott, if you're listening, you want to have a shot at running for president? Do something mature. Break away from Trump. Strike a side deal with Gavin Newsom. It'll help both of you. It'll elevate both of you politically. All right. I have more, but I filibustered poor Nicholas long enough. So here's what I did. For folks who weren't on last week, paid subscribers to Worth Knowing, thank you yet again, because one of the things that your support is enabling is for me to hire a college student, Nicholas Olbetter, who is here with us. And one of the assignments that I handed Nicholas over the last week or two is go out and help amplify, help augment what I'm trying to do to find things that are worth knowing. You emailed me right before we got online here to say, I found 3 things that I think are really worth knowing. Give me the first one. What have you found that you think people should know about?
The first story that I found comes from our favorite billionaire Nazi, Elon Musk. He is in hot waters again. There is currently a class action lawsuit from his shareholders because he was withholding information about the dangers associated with his robot taxis that he's trying to roll out. And I just think this is fantastic news and wanted it to share with everyone. So far,
It's self-evident why that one is worth knowing about.
It's worth knowing. I mean, he's lost $357 billion. That's so much money. That's insane. And he's going to lose more. I thought that was worth knowing.
That one is unassailably worth knowing. All right, I love it. Give me number 2.
The second one is on a little bit of a more serious note. It's about healthcare in the United States and what Trump is doing in that regards. Recently, he made claims that he is making deals with drug companies to reduce prices on certain pharmaceutical drugs by 1,500%. And as some sources have said, that is not possible. And I think this is important to know because I'm not the kind of person that whatever Trump does is bad. If he actually does end up reducing pharmaceutical prices on drugs, that is a great thing. But there's no universe in which he is good for healthcare when he has actively cut $1 trillion from Medicare with his Republican budget.
Let me just add on to that one for a second that I'm with you. I think it's very important to be intellectually honest and consistent. Those of us who are in the Democratic Party. And I actually put out a whole piece on Substack a week ago arguing that one thing that RFK Jr. had done to contain healthcare costs and try to shift things more toward the direction of preventative care and general medicine, less in the direction of compensating specialization and technology, was a good thing, was a positive, and it was done under Donald Trump. I agree with you. I think that kind of being willing to say, hey, this is a good thing, it came from the Trump administration, is an important thing so that we all retain our rationality. And I'll also point out one thing that I did in my little worth knowing roundup last week was, this was on Friday, was point out that Medicare drug costs are slated to go way up next year. It's an item first reported in the Wall Street Journal, something you should absolutely bookmark for next year's midterms. That premiums for Medicare drug plans are set to increase sharply next year due to rising costs, regulatory changes, and cutbacks to a subsidy program. The subsidy program, which sent extra federal funds to private insurers to offer drug benefits, known as Part D, had largely shielded seniors from rising monthly bills. This year, the Trump administration is set to cut spending on that program by about 40% in 2026. So yes, to your point, drug prices for seniors are going to go up thanks to Donald Trump. All right, give me number 3.
Number 3 is a little bit of international news. Currently, Trump is threatening to put more tariffs on India. The reason that he wants to do this is because they are continuing to buy Russian oil. For some note, the increase that they've been buying in Russian oil is only by 1%. 1% more Russian oil than before, and he's starting to throw in a whole bunch of tariffs to them. And I think this is important because both China and India are very large countries with very rapidly growing economies. And it would be good in general to have good relationships between large, potentially future superpowers. And if this trend continues of Trump attacking India or China over small differences, a 1% increase in the amount of oil they're buying from Russia, that's going to continue to deteriorate relationships between the US and other countries. And that would not be good.
I'll just add on to that. I think one of the things that gets so tricky when you talk about our relationship with India and the way to triangulate and make it a hedge in our very complex relationship with China is that, in theory, China remains the world's largest democracy. China is definitively not that. But of course, under Modi, that has become more complex. And, of course, one could say under Trump, the nature of our democracy has gotten more complex as well. And you start to think about the interrelationships with, trying to sanction Russia and trying to punish other countries for subsidizing Russia as they continue to commit untrammeled aggression in Ukraine. It does get complicated. But point very much taken. I mean, surely the way to get there is not more tariffs from Donald Trump. All right, Nicholas, thank you for those 3 very worth knowing tidbits. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to boot you and I'm going to wrap up here because we have gone over, and that's okay. It's fun. So we will see you again real soon. People can subscribe to Worth Knowing. You're working on an article right now that I teased a little bit earlier on. So I hope people will tune in for that. All right. See you soon.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, look, we do have to wrap up here. And thank you. Thank you, MJ. Yeah, I like these tidbits too. I really like doing this. And look, the final thing I'll say here is, again, as always, I really super appreciate people being active in the chats. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. I love doing these deep dives with smart people who have deep expertise and something to say. I've got a great one for you next week. I'm really looking forward to this one. And you can get yourself revved up here for it if you want. Turns out that the former chairman of the Democratic Party, Jamie Harrison, is an old friend of mine from Capitol Hill, and he has a new podcast. He has graciously agreed to join me next week. We're going to try, there's a little piece of technical innovation. We are going to try to live stream it not only to all the platforms that we're on that I rattled off at the beginning, to YouTube and Twitch and Facebook and X and LinkedIn, and to my Substack. We're going to also try to simultaneously live stream it to Jamie's Substack. We'll see. We'll see if it's glitchy, but I hope people will join next week and hear from Jamie. He's a super intelligent, interesting guy, Yale Law School. He is one of the real thoughtful people that I encountered in my work on Capitol Hill. I was really happy to see his career kind of go where it did and take off. And he's got some interesting things to say these days. And he's doing some interesting stuff in his podcast, talking to some of the leading voices in the Democratic Party. And it's cool stuff. So, all right, I'm going to wrap there. On that note, thanks very much to Dr. Mark Zandi. Thanks very much to intern Nicholas Olbetter. And thanks very much. Yes, the Cynthia Rice. I am happy to send me some tough questions for Jamie. I'll hit him. He is not afraid. He has dealt with the tough stuff before. So jump on Worth Knowing, jump on my chat and send them to me, and I will hit them. All right. Take care, everybody. I will see you soon. I will see you next week. Stay safe. Be well.